In political studies, historical rankings of presidents of the United States are surveys conducted in order to construct rankings of the success of individuals who have served as president of the United States. Ranking systems are usually based on surveys of academic historians and political scientists or popular opinion. The rankings focus on the presidential achievements, leadership qualities, failures, and faults. General findings: Franklin D. Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, and George Washington are consistently ranked at the top of the lists. Often ranked just below those presidents are Thomas Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt. The remaining places in the top 10 are often rounded out by Harry S. Truman, Woodrow Wilson, Dwight D. Eisenhower, James K. Polk, and Andrew Jackson. Recent presidents such as John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, and Bill Clinton tend to be rated among the greatest in world opinion polls, but do not always rank as highly among presidential scholars and historians. The bottom 10 often includes Andrew Johnson, Franklin Pierce, Warren G. Harding, Millard Fillmore, James Buchanan, Herbert Hoover, Richard M. Nixon, Zachary Taylor, and John Tyler. Because William Henry Harrison and James A. Garfield both died shortly after taking office, they are sometimes omitted from presidential rankings. Zachary Taylor also died after serving as president for only 16 months, but is usually included. In the case of these three, it is not clear if they received low rankings due to their actions as president, or because each was president for such a limited time that it is not possible to assess them more thoroughly. Political scientist Walter Dean Burnham noted the dichotomous or schizoid profiles of presidents, which can make some hard to classify. Historian Alan Brinkley said, "There are presidents who could be considered both failures and great or near great." James McGregor Burns observed of Nixon, "How can one evaluate such an idiosyncratic president, so brilliant and so morally lacking?" David H. Donald, noted biographer of Lincoln, relates that when he met John F. Kennedy in 1961, Kennedy voiced his deep dissatisfaction and resentment with historians who had rated some of his predecessors. Kennedy said, "No one has a right to grade a president, even poor James Buchanan, who has not sat in his chair, examined the mail and information that came across his desk, and learned why he made his decisions." Historian and political scientist Julian E. Zelizer argues that traditional presidential rankings explain little concerning actual presidential history, and that they are weak mechanisms for evaluating what has taken place in the White House. Conservative political commentator Ivan Eland wrote a book titled Recarving Rushmore, in which he wrote that historians' criteria are poor in the capacity to reflect presidents' actual services to the country. In the book, Eland chose to rate 40 U.S. presidents on the basis of whether the policies promoted prosperity, liberty, and non-interventionism, as well as modest executive roles for themselves. His final rankings varied significantly from those of most scholars. Notable scholar surveys. The 1948 poll was conducted by historian Arthur M. Schlesinger, Sr. of Harvard University. The 1962 survey was also conducted by Schlesinger, who surveyed 75 historians. Schlesinger's son Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., conducted another poll in 1996. The complete book of U.S. presidents also gives the results of the 1982 survey, a poll of 49 historians conducted by the Chicago Tribune. A notable difference from the 1962 Schlesinger poll was the ranking of Dwight D. Eisenhower, which rose from number 22 in 1962 to number 9 in 1982. The Siena Research Institute of Siena College conducted surveys in 1982, 1990, 1994, 2002, and 2010. The 1994 survey placed only 2 presidents, Franklin Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln, above 80 points, and 2 presidents, Andrew Johnson and Warren G. Harding, below 50 points. The 2010 Siena survey had George W. Bush plummet from the initial 2002 ranking of 23rd down to 39. The 1996 column shows the results from a poll conducted from 1988 to 1996 by William J. Ridings, Jr. and Stuart B. McIver, and published in Rating the Presidents, a ranking of U.S. leaders, from the great and honorable to the dishonest and incompetent. More than 719 people took part in the poll, primarily academic historians and political scientists, although some politicians and celebrities also took part. Participants from every state were included, and emphasis was placed upon getting input from female historians and specialists in African American studies, as well as a few non-American historians. Poll respondents rated the presidents in 5 categories, and the results were tabulated to create the overall ranking. A 2000 survey by the Wall Street Journal consisted of an ideologically balanced group of 132 prominent professors of history, law, and political science. This poll sought to include an equal number of liberals and conservatives in the survey, as the editors argued that previous polls were dominated by either one group or the other, but never balanced. According to the editors, this poll included responses from more women, minorities, and young professors than the 1996 Schlesinger poll. The editors noted that the results of the poll were remarkably similar to the 1996 Schlesinger poll, with the main difference in the 2000 poll being the lower rankings for the 1960s presidents Lyndon B. Johnson and John F. Kennedy, and higher ranking of President Ronald Reagan at number 8. Franklin Roosevelt still ranked in the top 3. Another presidential poll was conducted by the Wall Street Journal in 2005, with James Lindgren of Northwestern University Law School for the Federalist Society. As in the 2000 survey, the editors sought to balance the opinions of liberals and conservatives, adjusting the results to give Democratic and Republican-leaning scholars equal weight. Franklin D. Roosevelt still ranked in the top 3, but editor James Taranto noted that Democratic-leaning scholars rated George W. Bush the 6th worst president of all time, while Republican scholars rated him the 6th best, giving him a split decision rating of average. A 2006 Siena College poll of 744 professors reported the following results. George W. Bush has just finished 5 years as president. If today were the last day of his presidency, how would you rank him? The responses were: great 2%, near great 5%, average 11%, below average 24%, failure 58%. In your judgment, do you think he has a realistic chance of improving his rating? 2/3 responded no, less than a quarter responded yes, and 10% chose no. Opinion are not applicable. Thomas Kelly, Professor Emeritus of American Studies at Siena College, said, President Bush would seem to have small hope for high marks from the current generation of practicing historians and political scientists. In this case, current public opinion polls actually seem to cut the president more slack than the experts do. Dr. Douglas Lundstrom, Siena College professor of statistics and director of the Siena Research Institute, stated, in our 2002 presidential rating, with a group of experts comparable to this current poll, President Bush ranked 23rd of 42 presidents. That was shortly after 9/11. Clearly, the professors do not think things have gone well for him in the past few years. These are the experts that teach college students today and will write the history of this era tomorrow. A 2010 Siena poll of 238 presidential scholars found that former President George W. Bush was ranked 39th out of 43, with poor ratings in handling of the economy, communication, ability to compromise, foreign policy accomplishments, and intelligence. Meanwhile, the current president, Barack Obama, was ranked 15th out of 43, with high ratings for imagination, communication ability and intelligence, and a low rating for background. The C-SPAN survey of presidential leadership consists of rankings from a group of presidential historians and professional observers of the presidency, who ranked presidents in a number of categories initially in 2000 and more recently in 2009. With some minor variation, both surveys found that historians consider Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Franklin D. Roosevelt the three best presidents by a wide margin, and William Henry Harrison, Warren G. Harding, Andrew Johnson, Franklin Pierce, George W. Bush, and James Buchanan the worst. In 2008, the Times Daily newspaper of London asked 8 of its own top international and political commentators to rank all 42 U.S. presidents in order of greatness. In 2011, through the agency of its United States Presidency Center, the Institute for the Study of the Americas released the first ever UK academic survey to rate U.S. presidents. This polled the opinion of British specialists in American history and politics to assess presidential performance. They also gave an interim assessment of Barack Obama, but his unfinished presidency was not included in the survey. In 2012, Newsweek magazine asked a panel of historians to rank the 10 best presidents since 1900. The results showed that historians had ranked Franklin D. Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, Woodrow Wilson, Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, Dwight Eisenhower, Bill Clinton, and Ronald Reagan as the best since that year. A 2013 History News Network poll of 203 American historians, when asked to rate Barack Obama's presidency on an AF scale, gave him a B grade. Obama, whom historians graded using 15 separate measures plus an overall grade, was rated most highly in the categories of communication ability, integrity, and crisis management, and most poorly for his relationship with Congress, transparency, and accountability. A 2015 poll, administered by the American Political Science Association among political scientists specializing in the American presidency, had Abraham Lincoln in the top spot with George Washington, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, Harry S. Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Bill Clinton, Andrew Jackson, and Woodrow Wilson cracking the top 10. The results of this poll are reflected in the table below. Scholar survey results: blue backgrounds indicate first quartile. Green backgrounds indicate second quartile. Orange backgrounds indicate third quartile. Red backgrounds indicate fourth quartile. Note: click the sort icon at the head of each column to view the rankings for each survey in numerical order. Asterisk ranking calculated before President had completed his term in office. Asterisk asterisk. The Times poll is a British newspaper's poll of 8 of its own journalists, not of academics. Note: Grover Cleveland was elected to 2 non-consecutive terms, serving as both the 22nd 22nd and 24th President of the United States. To date he is the only person to have achieved this distinction. Because of it, the total number of people who have served as president is one fewer than the number of presidents in order of succession. Liberal and conservative raters. The Murray Blessing 1982 survey asked historians whether they were liberal or conservative on domestic, social and economic issues. The table below shows that the two groups had only small differences in ranking the best and worst presidents. Both groups agreed on the composition of 9 of the top 10 presidents and 6 of the worst 7. Excluded Group's ranking approach. In 2002, Ronald Walters, a former director of the University of Maryland's African American Leadership Institute, stated that presidents ranked by how each president balanced the interests of majority interests and the interests of excluded groups was practical. In respect to American debate on racial politics, presidents have traditionally been ranked on personal qualities and the leadership ability to solve problems that move the nation in a positive direction. Walters stated there was a qualitative difference between white and African American intellectuals in evaluating presidents. In the 1996 New York Times Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. poll, 31 white historians and 1 black historian ranked presidents on differing categories of greatness. In a survey done by Professor Haynes Walton, Jr. and Professor Robert Smith in the textbook American Politics and the African American Quest for Universal Freedom, 44 African American political scientists and historians ranked presidents in terms of racial attitudes and racial legislation proposed. Individual presidents' attitudes, policies, and perspectives were historically ranked in 5 categories: white supremacist, racist, racially neutral, racially ambivalent, anti-racist. Popular opinion. C-SPAN poll. In addition to conducting a historian survey, C-SPAN also conducted a presidential leadership survey of 1145 viewers in December 1999. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, Harry S. Truman, Woodrow Wilson, Thomas Jefferson, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, James K. Polk, Andrew Jackson, James Monroe, William McKinley, John Adams, Grover Cleveland, James Madison, John Quincy Adams, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, William Howard Taft, Richard Nixon, Rutherford B. Hayes, Calvin Coolidge, Zachary Taylor, James A. Garfield, Martin Van Buren, Benjamin Harrison, Chester A. Arthur, Ulysses S. Grant, Herbert Hoover, Millard Fillmore, John Tyler, William Henry Harrison, Warren G. Harding, Franklin Pierce, Andrew Johnson, James Buchanan. ABC poll. An ABC News poll about presidential greatness, taken February 16 to 20, 2000, asked 1,012 adults in the U.S. who do you think was the greatest American president? Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, Franklin D. Roosevelt. No opinion. Ronald Reagan, George Washington, Bill Clinton, Theodore Roosevelt, George H.W. Bush, Thomas Jefferson, Harry S. Truman, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Washington College poll. A Washington College poll about presidential greatness, taken February 11, 2005, asked 800 adults in the U.S., thinking about all the presidents of the United States throughout history to the present, who would you say was America's greatest president? Abraham Lincoln, Ronald Reagan, Franklin D. Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Bill Clinton. Other, don't know. George W. Bush, George Washington, Theodore Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, Jimmy Carter, Thomas Jefferson, Richard Nixon, John Adams, Andrew Jackson, Lyndon B. Johnson. Gallup Poll. A Gallup poll about presidential greatness, taken February 2–5, 2011, asked 10–15 adults in the U.S., who do you regard as the greatest United States president? Ronald Reagan, Abraham Lincoln, Bill Clinton, John F. Kennedy, George Washington, Franklin Roosevelt, Barack Obama, Theodore Roosevelt, Harry Truman, George W. Bush, Thomas Jefferson, Jimmy Carter, Dwight Eisenhower, George H. W. Bush, Andrew Jackson, Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon. Rasmussen Poll. According to a Rasmussen poll conducted in 2007, 6 presidents: George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and John F. Kennedy, were rated favorably by at least 80% of Americans. Recent president polls. These polls evaluate recent presidents only. 2010 Gallup Poll. A Gallup poll taken on November 19–21, 2010, asked Americans to say, based on what they know or remember about the 9 most recent former presidents, whether they approve or disapprove of how each handled his job in office. John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George H. W. Bush, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Lyndon B. Johnson, George W. Bush, Richard Nixon. Public policy polling. A public policy polling poll, taken between September 8–11, 2011, asked 665 American voters, based on what they know or remember about the 9 most recent former presidents, whether they hold favorable or unfavorable views of how each handled his job in office. John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George H. W. Bush, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Lyndon B. Johnson, George W. Bush, Richard Nixon. Vision Critical Angus Reid Poll. A Vision Critical Angus Reid poll, taken on February 18–19, 2011, asked respondents about 11 former presidents plus the current president and whether they were a good or bad president. John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Harry S. Truman, Jimmy Carter, George H. W. Bush, Barack Obama, Gerald Ford, Lyndon B. Johnson, George W. Bush, Richard Nixon. 2013 Gallup Poll. A Gallup poll, taken November 7–10, 2013, asked 1039 adults in the U.S., how do you think each of the following presidents will go down in history: as an outstanding president, above average, average, below average, or poor? Quinnipiac Poll. A Quinnipiac University poll, taken June 24–30, 2014, asked 1446 registered voters in the U.S. who they thought were the best and worst presidents since World War II. Best president since World War II: Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, John F. Kennedy, Barack Obama, Dwight Eisenhower, Harry S. Truman, Lyndon B. Johnson, George H. W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, George W. Bush. Worst president since World War II: Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, Lyndon B. Johnson, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Gerald Ford, George H. W. Bush, Dwight Eisenhower, Harry S. Truman, John F. Kennedy. Siena College Research Institute Survey. 538 Analysis. In January 2013, New York Times journalist and statistician Nate Silver of 538 composed a composite list of previous presidential rankings by scholars, for the purpose of predicting President Barack Obama's ranking among presidents. Abraham Lincoln, Franklin D. Roosevelt, George Washington, Theodore Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, Harry Truman, Woodrow Wilson, Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, James K. Polk, Lyndon B. Johnson, Andrew Jackson, James Monroe, James Madison, John Adams, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, William McKinley, John Quincy Adams, Grover Cleveland, George H. W. Bush, Ulysses S. Grant, Gerald Ford, William Howard Taft, Jimmy Carter, Calvin Coolidge, Chester A. Arthur, Richard Nixon, James A. Garfield, Martin Van Buren, Rutherford B. Hayes, Zachary Taylor, Benjamin Harrison, Herbert Hoover, John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, George W. Bush, Andrew Johnson, William Henry Harrison, Warren G. Harding, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan. Memorability of the presidents. In November 2014, Henry L. Roediger III and K. Andrew DeSoto published a study in the journal Science asking research subjects to name as many presidents as possible. They reported data from 3 generations, as well as from an online survey conducted in 2014. The percentage of participants in the online survey sample who could name each president was Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, George H. W. Bush, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, Thomas Jefferson, Ronald Reagan, Gerald Ford, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Harry Truman, Andrew Jackson, Herbert Hoover, Lyndon B. Johnson, Andrew Johnson, William Howard Taft, James Madison, Ulysses S. Grant, James Monroe, Woodrow Wilson, Calvin Coolidge, James A. Garfield, James K. Polk, Warren G. Harding, William McKinley, John Tyler, James Buchanan, Grover Cleveland, William Henry Harrison, Benjamin Harrison, Martin Van Buren, Rutherford B. Hayes, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, Chester A. Arthur,